Hi folks, Eric Bourne here with Harrisburg Area Community College. I'm going to do a discussion on some of the readings from our book Current Issues and Enduring Questions. We're going to be looking at We Have No Right to Happiness by C.S. Lewis, About Love by Daniel Crittenden, and I Want a Wife by Judy Brady. I'll be trying to help you with some of the big ideas, help you dig into the conversations, discussions that happen with these texts. Let's start with Mr. Lewis. First of all, this essay starts with some neighborhood drama, some of the local gossip. It starts Lewis thinking about happiness. Now, this is sort of the scandal of the essay here. He focuses on a couple of his neighbors who divorced their former spouses so that they could marry each other. Now, that isn't necessarily an uncommon thing these days, but part of what makes the situation awkward is how much their former spouses had invested into them throughout the course of their earlier marriages, and how they respond afterwards. One of the divorced spouses commits suicide. Now, in thinking about this, Lewis's neighbor says, "But what could I do? A man has a right to happiness. I had to take my one chance when it came." Now, Lewis is intrigued by this, being a philosopher, and he dives right into the language of it, and he really wants to disentangle what it means, what it doesn't mean. And that's much of the second page of this article, is him teasing out the phrase right to happiness, as he doesn't think it makes sense as a right. When he looks at other kinds of rights, things that you have as a person, not because government gives them to you, but because you are a person. Think of the Declaration of Independence, the things it lays out as our human rights. The Declaration isn't a set of laws, it's a description of how we treat people because they're people. And so, for example, a right to free speech. Now, happiness strikes something as Lewis that you can't be guaranteed by a right in the same way that you can't be given the right to be 7 feet tall. It seems to him be something that doesn't necessarily rely on choices you make, that isn't rely on choices others make. It's a combination of things that sometimes comes together in a good way for you and sometimes doesn't. He does note that the Declaration does allow you the right to pursue happiness, your right to try to be happy, your right to do things that you think will lead to a happy life, but you don't have a right to the result. Our question is, in this case then, why does the idea of a right to happiness seem so compelling to people? Why does his neighbor, why does his friend Claire think that this is a good argument for this situation? Now, Lewis thinks this doesn't really have much to do with rights or with happiness, but rather our culture's attitude toward sex. He thinks that this is based on our interest in not putting restrictions on sexual behaviors. Now, this is somewhat a very, context-specific discussion. This essay is happening right in the thick of the sexual revolution of the 20th century, where a few inventions and a few social changes really encouraged much more looser attitudes toward sexuality than we've seen in many cultures in human history. Lewis thinks that our culture has gone too far with this attitude, that we're willing to accept any kind of promise-breaking, indecency, lapses of faith, as long as it's in the name of sexual happiness. And he thinks that our experience should show us that this is the case, and that these neighborhood friends of his who engaged through all that trauma in their previous relationships. He wonders how long their happiness here is going to last. And he says most of us know that this sort of giddy feeling of love doesn't really last, that we really can't be sure of it. And he suggests that the trade-off that they made was poor judgment. Let's dive into About Love by Danielle Crittenden. Crittenden is actually expressing a fairly similar idea to Lewis. She's also criticizing our culture's attitude towards relationships. And she thinks that we are focusing too much on this idea of autonomy or independence, the need to be oneself, as she quotes someone in this essay. And she would say that women in particular are trying not to rely, trying not to depend on others, not to get into relationships, not to settle down, but to live in this state of flux, of change, of things being open for being rewritten. She sees that attitude leading to a bad state of mind and to poor life choices. See what she says about autonomy here. She says, too often autonomy is merely the excuse of someone who is so fearful, so weak, that he or she can't bear to take on any of the responsibilities that used to be shouldered by much younger, but more robust and mature souls. Okay, so she's saying here that because we're trying to be independent and self-sufficient, that we're just not capable of kind of responsibilities that our grandfathers did when they started getting married. And they were getting married and starting families and homes at a much younger age than many of us are these days. The teenage wedding was a pretty common thing. And she looks back on that time and sees that as an indication of maturity, of being more robust, stronger, able to take on these responsibilities. She sees many examples of this kind of a problem in our society, in the way that we're still dating into our 30s, that we're engaging in our relationships in a way that keeps us free to cast them aside if we find someone else or it doesn't quite meet our needs. And she sees that as this leading to us to not being people who can commit. She suggests that we should, at a much earlier age than we do now, take a serious attitude toward dating and begin preparing ourselves to settle down, for it's in the act of taking up the roles we've been taught to avoid or postpone, wife, husband, mother, father, that we build our identities, expand our lives, and achieve the fullness of character we desire. And you see how much she is putting the emphasis on relationship, that being a spouse, that being a parent is fundamentally who we are as people, and she wants us to be growing ourselves through these roles. Now, to be fair, she does acknowledge a little bit of why women are in this situation today. She says this pull between the desire to be loved and to love and the desire to be free is an old, fierce one. And she's noting here that, we're desiring to be free even if that keeps us away from love. And she notes our grandmothers, the error our grandmothers made was to let the desire to love and be loved be more important than this desire to be free, that to be giving up freedom for love. She does note that if their error was to have surrendered too much of themselves forever, this was perhaps better than not being prepared to surrender anything at all. So she thinks that we lost something valuable, that perhaps our grandmothers were not sacrificing too much in these younger marriages, these younger families. Let's look at one more. Let's look at Judy Brady's I Want a Wife. Now, after a couple of readings that are largely picking on feminism, we have a text that is very much embraced by the feminist community. It's looking at gender roles. This is looking at what we expect of men and women respectively when, in this case in particular, when they are in a relationship. Now, it's important to recognize that Brady is not being particularly serious here. Well, maybe serious isn't the right way to put it. She is not telling her your opinion straight out. We definitely need to do some reading in between the lines here. Let's notice some of the things that happen in the paragraphs of this essay where she talks to you about what kind of a wife she wants. She says, I want a wife who will not bother me with rambling complaints about a wife's duties. But I want a wife who will listen to me when I feel the need to explain a rather difficult point I have come across in my course of studies. And I want a wife who will type my papers for me when I have written them. Notice that contrast between the wife's duties and the husband's duties here. We want the wife who's not going to complain no matter how much she's had to do with the house, the kids, and the work. But the moment that the husband apparently wants to complain about something trivial, she's supposed to be very pay attention and be very considerate and sympathetic. And then add on to her list of duties for the day to type my papers for me. Sometimes these essays show a little bit when they were written. Aren't you glad you were not in the day where you had to type things up separately from writing them? Or maybe you are in those days. Let's take another look. The paragraph on the second page of her essay about sex in particular, I think really highlights how upset Brady is about the double standards involved in the way we often think about gender roles. She says, I want a wife who will remain sexually faithful to me so that I do not have to clutter up my intellectual life with jealousies. And I want a wife who understands that my sexual needs may entail more than strict adherence to monogamy. I must, after all, be able to relate to people as fully as possible. That clearly shows us that I think Brady is not seriously advocating that this is the kind of wife she wants, and please send her a letter with your qualifications and your phone number. Instead, she's showing us this is just an unfair expectation. It's horribly unfair to expect our wives to be monogamous and wholly faithful to us as husbands while we feel free to have affairs. And that's just a double standard that our relationships really can't bear. I love the close of this essay. My God, who wouldn't want a wife? Really drives home her concern that our culture easily expects too much of our wives and our mothers. Really freeing men to focus their attention and their energies elsewhere. From a feminist perspective, this might explain why men can get further along in their careers than women. Why men still in certain fields get paid more than women. Why a woman who maintains a career while sending her children to daycare feels kind of often a nagging sense of guilt about this, and why our culture kind of makes fun a bit of the husbands who opt to stay home and raise the children instead of their careers. These types of expectation for gender roles are very powerful. They shape our behavior in many ways. I definitely have some embarrassing stories of my own in that regard. I have turned down an umbrella walking between buildings on this campus in a downpour because the umbrella was pink. You'd think I could swallow my pride and carry a pink umbrella. Apparently gender roles are holding me back a little bit more than they should. Now, a pink umbrella, a little bit of a wet shirt, that isn't big situation. But this is definitely something that I think is worth thinking about in terms of our relationships. The way I treat my wife and my children, this should be conscious. I should be shouldering an equal burden of the responsibilities of having a family. I should not be putting all that on my wife. And to that extent, I definitely like where Judy Brady goes with this. Definitely a lot of questions still open with it. Where do these expectations come from? How have they changed since her time? But those are all questions worthy of a lot more consideration than this video can provide. Hope this helped you out with working with some of these texts, and I hope this leads you to some interesting questions as you prepare to write your first essay for me. Be in touch if you have questions.